Hello, you're watching The Interview. I'm pleased to welcome Kenneth Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, one of the world's most prominent human rights organizations with operations in more than 90 countries. Roth has led HRW since 1993. A former federal prosecutor, he's written widely about international justice, counterterrorism, the UN, and the foreign policies of the major world powers. He's also conducted numerous human rights investigations around the world. Welcome back to the program, Kenneth.
Good to be back. Thank you.
Let's start with the annual report which Human Rights Watch has published this January, and the main gist of your summary is that human rights can be protected from populist challenges, but they're not always protected. So what are the conditions in which they are protected or not?
Well, it's interesting. When we look back at the last year, I mean, a year ago, Trump was just entering the White House, and it was a moment of despair. It seemed as if the authoritarian populists were on the rise, and there was nothing you could do to stop them. But in the last year, there actually has been an outpouring of resistance in many countries. The reason we chose to release the report in France is because in many ways a turning point was the electoral campaign of Emmanuel Macron, who chose to confront the populists, in this case the National Front, not by coming as close to them as he could and sort of trying to be far-right light, but rather by openly confronting them, openly embracing democratic principles. And of course, he won overwhelmingly.
Yeah, and you say France represented the most prominent example of successful resistance to xenophobic populism. So essentially, when that doesn't happen, or when there's a lack of international concern, that's when repression ticks up. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's when it really takes off. And so you take something like President Erdogan in Turkey, where the European Union was much more interested in convincing him to continue to stop the flow of refugees to Europe. So they said very little about his decimation of Turkish democracy, his destruction of the checks and balances on his executive authority. And you can say the same thing about President Sisi in Egypt, or President Duterte in the Philippines, or even somebody like Xi Jinping in China, where everybody was much more concerned about signing Chinese contracts than they were with the repression of the Chinese people.
But, I mean, given the optimistic take that your organization has in this annual report about France, are you surprised then by the front cover of L'Obs magazine? I want to play this for our viewers. A controversial front cover which says, "Migrants, welcome to the country of human rights." An ironic caption, and that picture of Emmanuel Macron's head surrounded by barbed wire. This obviously refers to things like proposals for ID checks in migrant shelters, and also the physical violence which has been committed against migrants in France. What do you think now that he's been in power for a while?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think Macron's record has been mixed. He's done some things right, but he's fallen short in significant ways as well. I mean, if you take the issue of the migrants, he went to Calais and he said to the police, don't beat, don't mistreat the migrants, whoever they are, asylum seekers, economic migrants, it doesn't matter, don't do it. And he said it to their face. Now, that was impressive. He's also been very good about making clear that nobody should be forced back to Libya, the source of most migration today. But he's been, more ambivalent about rejecting the Italian approach, which is to get the Libyan Coast Guard to do indirectly what the European Union won't do directly, and just keep people from ever getting out of Libya, despite the horrendous conditions of detention there. There are elements of his proposal domestically, speeding up asylum seeker procedures. Maybe that's good, so people don't have to wait around forever, as long as it's not summary.
Of course, it's been the various organizations here have said the time in which asylum seekers will be able to appeal a negative decision makes it basically impossible for them to stay in France. If this law goes through, of course, it has yet to be considered by the National Assembly.
Well, I mean, that's why things like this you have to look at, is this going to just be faster procedures, or is it going to be summary justice? And summary justice is really no justice. So we have to watch that. But you're right about things like having control, ID checks in emergency shelters. That should never happen. People should be able to seek shelter and not worry about being deported the next day. So there are limits that I'm afraid in some cases Macron is transgressing, but in other cases he's doing the right thing.
You mentioned on the foreign policy side of things, he's hosted various strongman or authoritarian presidents, depends on what term you want to use. I was very struck when I was covering his press conference with President Sisi of Egypt, and Sisi said, you've got to understand here in the West that human rights is not just political rights, it's also economic and social rights. Is Human Rights Watch, your organization, underplaying that? Because you do focus a lot on political rights. What about the economic and social rights? Because that's what people like Sisi want you to focus on when you make these criticisms.
They're both important, but the best route to getting economic progress is having a government that is accountable to its people. You take an autocrat like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. It's been an economic disaster, a potentially oil-rich country, one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and there's hyperinflation. People can't find food. They can't find medicine. That's what happens when an unaccountable government serves itself rather than its people. And so Sisi talks about economic progress. He talks about providing regional stability, but he's providing repression, and he's basically serving his own perpetuation in power. He's not letting anybody run against him. He's preventing any kind of even moderate political Islam, which is exactly what the jihadists want. I mean, the jihadists want the choice to be military dictatorship or us, violent reaction. And that's, that's a disaster, but that's Sisi's approach.
I have to ask you about Donald Trump, of course.
Yes.
How do you see the state of human rights in the US in 2017?
Yeah, I mean, Trump has been a disaster for human rights, starting with the campaign where he broke every taboo in the book. And these taboos are there for a reason. But he seemed to relish the idea of embracing racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, misogyny. And I'm afraid that really lowered the barrier to legitimate political discourse.
But you're saying he sort of encouraged an atmosphere rather than actually did anything that was in violation of international law.
Well, I mean, in terms of what he has done, for example, he has started large-scale deportations of long-time undocumented migrants, long-time residents. And so raids on the interior of the country are up 43%. I mean, that's a big problem. His Attorney General, Sessions, has reinstituted the drug war. He's reinstituted the mass incarceration approach. I mean, these are all deeply problematic steps from a human rights perspective. And of course, his foreign policy has been a disaster.
Well, I was going to come on to that because I was looking at your tweets, and it's clear that you see this rift opening up in 2017 between liberals and populists. And you say in one of your tweets, the challenge for Macron and Merkel at Davos this year will be to defend rights-based governance from leaders like Trump and Modi. So that's clearly a global shift and a rift. But what do you mean exactly by defending rights-based governance in practical terms?
Well, Trump and Modi want to go to Davos and say, our economies are doing fine, leave us alone. And it's important for Merkel and Macron to say, well, no, actually, democratic governance is about, allowing popular input into what the priorities of government are going to be. And so if you pursue, as Modi, for example, essentially unleashing the Hindu nationalists to attack Muslims, or what Trump is doing, which is sort of demonizing the vulnerable minorities within the United States, that's not governance for everybody. That's sort of saying we're going to take a majoritarian view of democracy and the minorities be damned. But of course, if governments get to pick and choose whose rights are respected, ultimately all of our rights are insecure.
Speaking of minorities, you've been making a lot of comments about the Rohingya crisis and particularly underlining that guarantees have not been taken for the security or welfare or citizenship of any refugees that might be repatriated. But in practical terms, how could that be achieved? I mean, beyond sort of saying this needs to happen, but is there any leverage?
Well, the big leverage in the case of Burma or Myanmar is targeted economic sanctions directed toward the military leaders behind this massive ethnic cleansing, the crimes against humanity, the mass killings and rape and arson that led 650,000 Rohingya to flee for their lives to Bangladesh. Now, the reason targeted economic sanctions have not been widely endorsed by the West is because of a misguided deference to Aung San Suu Kyi. But it's become completely clear that this civilian leader who was once a pro-democracy icon at this stage is never going to come to the defense of the Rohingya.
But so far there hasn't been a sea change in terms of the approach of Western powers towards her, has there?
Well, I think there's been a sea change in global attitudes toward her, and I think it's a matter of time before governments come around and recognize that they should no longer be deferring to Aung San Suu Kyi to define how they respond to crimes against humanity against the Rohingya. She's not going to defend them, and that is completely wrong.
One final news area which we do need to talk about is obviously the crisis in Yemen. And again, I've been looking at your recent tweets. You have a lot to say about the actions of the Saudi-led coalition. Recently, I haven't seen much of criticism of the behavior of Houthi rebels. Presumably that's because you don't want to draw moral equivalence between the actions of the two.
Well, they're not morally equivalent. I mean, Human Rights Watch actually has criticized the Houthi for a number of things, including, indiscriminately firing towards Saudi Arabia and detaining political prisoners and the like, using child soldiers. But the vast majority of the atrocities are at the hands of the Saudi-led coalition. They're the ones who are bombing civilians and civilian infrastructure. They're the ones who've been blockading Yemen. And that's why we have some 7 million civilians facing famine and 1 million people who have contracted cholera, the world's largest humanitarian crisis. And in the meantime, the U.S., the U.K., France continues to sell arms to the Saudis. So there's a need for a really different approach. The biggest good news with respect to Saudi Arabia this year was that the Netherlands, of all countries, not exactly a superpower, sponsored and actually won a UN-launched international investigation of the war crimes in Yemen, despite vehement Saudi opposition. So it is possible to get things done, but you need somebody to exert leadership. The major powers didn't do it on Yemen.
We'll have to end on that sobering thought. Thank you so much, Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Stay tuned, more news coming up here on France 24.